You pull the line back and the worm is gone. The hook is clean, bright, untouched. Or worse, half a worm, a wet stub, and not one fish to show for the whole morning. The float twitched. You set the hook. Nothing. You bait up, drop it in again. The float ticks. You swing, and the hook comes back naked one more time. Here is the part nobody on the bank will tell you. By the time that float twitched, the whole thing was already finished. The fish had arrived, fed, and left. We know this because the strike has been filmed, not on a phone, but in a laboratory, on cameras shooting 500 frames every single second, and when you slow a feeding bluegill down to that speed and step through it one frame at a time, the take is over in roughly 13 milliseconds. 13 thousandths of 1 second. Your float is not reporting the bite, it is reporting the aftershock. The modern tackle industry has an answer ready for your empty hook. Thinner fluorocarbon, a more sensitive float, a $30 micro jig that promises to telegraph every nibble. All of it sold to fix what they call a bite detection problem. But the footage says the bite was never the problem. The whole thing was decided in those 13 milliseconds, inside a window of geometry and timing that the tackle aisle has no reason to explain to you. Because the real fix costs nothing, and nothing is hard to sell. This is Forbidden Lures. Today we do the thing the industry has spent decades steering you away from. We run the strike in slow motion, frame by frame, and watch exactly how a bluegill eats your bait without ever touching your hook. Then we hand you the same 2 corrections the old bank fishermen made by feel, generations before anyone owned a high-speed camera. By the end, your hook stops coming back empty. Not because you bought anything, but because you finally saw what was happening in the dark. So let us roll it back and watch the first frame. Start with how the mouth actually works, because everything else is downstream of it. Picture a kitchen turkey baster. You squeeze the bulb, let go, and the rubber snaps back, sucking a slug of liquid up the tube. A bluegill is a turkey baster with a fish wrapped around it. When it decides to eat, it does not bite down. It drops the floor of its mouth, flares its gill covers, and snaps its whole head open into an expanding chamber. Water, and anything floating in that water, gets dragged inward. Scientists call this suction feeding, and the bluegill is one of the most studied suction feeders on the planet. This is where the footage turns violent. Researchers at the University of California, Davis, led by the biologist Peter Wainwright, filmed bluegill striking prey while measuring the water flow with particle image velocimetry lasers, a technique that lights up the moving water so every current becomes visible. Step to the frame at peak strike. Their published work in the Journal of Experimental Biology shows bluegill generating inward flow as fast as 2.5 meters per second, and it shows the peak of that suction landing at the exact instant the mouth reaches 95% of fully open. The fish times its hardest pull to its widest gape. This is not a sloppy gulp, it is a precision event. Now here is the detail the tackle aisle will never put on a package. That brutal vacuum is tiny. In the same studies, the high-speed flow reaches out only about half the width of the fish's own mouth, and it is essentially gone 1 mouth width away. The kill zone is no bigger than the mouth itself. Anything sitting outside that little sphere does not get inhaled. It gets nibbled, calmly, from the edge. Hold that against your rig. If you are dangling 4 inches of nightcrawler, the fish parks at the far end of your worm, outside the vacuum entirely, and feeds on the part your hook can never reach. The float twitches. The worm shortens. The hook never moves through anything but empty water. You are not getting unlucky bites. You are watching a precision instrument feed in a zone you placed your hook outside of. And the size of that vacuum is only half the reason your hook set keeps failing. The other half is force, and on that number, the bluegill embarrasses a fish 10 times its size. Everyone treats the bluegill as the beginner's fish, the thing you catch as a kid before you graduate to bass. The footage tells a different story, and it is one of the most quietly buried facts in freshwater fishing. Biologists sort suction feeders into 2 camps. Think of 2 ways to lift water out of a barrel. One is a wide bucket, moving a huge volume in one slow scoop. The other is a syringe, a narrow nozzle with a piston slamming behind it, moving less water but with savage speed and pressure. The largemouth bass is the bucket. It has a cavernous mouth and engulfs prey by sheer volume. The bluegill is the syringe, small mouth, but a body packed with muscle driving an explosive, high-pressure pull. Here is the result that should change how you respect this fish. When Wainwright's group at Davis, with the researchers Stephen Day, Timothy Hyam, and Roy Holzman, actually measured the force a bluegill puts on its prey and set it against a largemouth bass, the bluegill came out higher. The little panfish delivers more pulling force at the prey than the bass does. The same work found that bluegill time, their strikes to land around 70% of the maximum force they are physically capable of. They are not just strong, they are calibrated. Now feel what that means for your tackle. Drop a thick, heavy wire hook and a fat lead split shot into that syringe's intake, and the fish gets instant feedback. The mass refuses to accelerate the way a real insect would. To a predator this finely tuned, that hesitation is a tripwire. It detects the wrongness and aborts mid-pull. On your end, that looks like a twitch that dies, a float that dips and lifts, a take that never commits. The industry sells you a more sensitive float so you can watch that happen in higher resolution. It does not sell you the fine wire hook that would have let the strike complete, because there is no margin in telling a customer to use less. This is the heart of what gets suppressed. They market the bluegill as simple so you keep buying gear built for a different animal. The footage shows a refined, high-force predator that punishes a clumsy rig in 13 milliseconds flat. So if the mouth is a high-pressure syringe with a vacuum the size of a marble, the only question left is how big that mouth really is. Let us put a ruler on it. A bluegill's mouth is small, and it stays small its entire life. Even a true bull, a deep slab that fills your whole hand, opens a mouth only about as wide as the tip of your finger. State fisheries agencies say it plainly in their own beginner guides. The bluegill has a small mouth even as an adult, so use small tackle. They tell you the what. They almost never tell you the why, or what it means for the metal on your line. Here is what the tackle aisle is built to hide. Walk into any big box store, and the bins at eye level are full of size 4 and size 6 hooks. Why those? Because they are easy for adult fingers to bait, easy to display, and easy to sell in bulk. Not because they fit a bluegill. They do not. And there is a second trick hidden in the numbering itself. Hook sizes have no universal standard. A size 6 in one pattern is not the same physical hook as a size 6 in another. A circle hook and an Aberdeen hook, stamped with the same number, can differ noticeably. The number on the package is a loose suggestion, not a measurement. So matching by number alone is a guess the industry is happy to let you keep making. The old bank fishermen did not guess. They had a test, and they used it before hook sizes were ever printed on packaging. The rule was simple. The gap of the hook, the open distance between the point and the shank, should be about as wide as the fish's mouth at its widest. For a hand-sized bluegill, that is roughly the width of your thumbnail. Hold the hook up next to your nail. If the gap is wider than the nail, it goes back in the box. The fish has not changed in 100 years. Your thumbnail has not changed. Only the marketing changed. In practice, that drops you to a size 8, 10, or even 12. A size 8 is the everyday workhorse. A 10 suits clearer water and warier fish. A 12 is for heavily pressured ponds where the fish have seen too many hooks, and reach for a fine wire, long shank pattern, the Aberdeen, or a light dry fly hook like the Mustad 94-840, which has been the standard dry fly hook for over a century from a company that has made hooks since 1877. The point is not the brand, the point is the wire. A thin, light hook carries almost no mass, so when that syringe of a mouth pulls, the hook rides the current straight in instead of hanging back and tripping the alarm. The fine wire finishes the strike the heavy wire kills. But here is the cruel part. You can pin the perfect small hook on your line, and the fish will still rob you blind because of where on the bait it chooses to attack. And that attack point is the single most important frame in this entire film. Run the strike again, but this time watch the worm, not the fish. A bluegill comes up under a hanging nightcrawler and does not lunge at the middle, where your hook is hidden. It goes for the lowest free end, the tail, dangling below the bend, the part farthest from anything sharp. Anglers have watched this for generations, and named it perfectly. The fish is feeding from the wrong end. It draws that loose tail into the marble-size vacuum, snips off what fits, and backs away. Several inches of worm can disappear an inch at a time, and the point never enters the picture. Every one of those is a real bite and an impossible hookup. The correction is the second thing the old-timers fixed, and it is almost insultingly simple. Stop giving the fish a free end. Do not thread a whole crawler onto a panfish hook. Pinch off a piece 1 to 2 inches long and use only that. A 1-inch nub on a size 8 hook leaves nothing trailing below the bend. Now the fish cannot feed from the edge, because there is no edge. To get any of the bait, it has to take all of it, and taking all of it means taking the hook into that mouth. You stop feeding the lake and start catching it. The bait cup lasts twice as long too. Then there is the third mistake, the one borrowed straight from bass fishing and quietly sold to panfish anglers as gospel: burying the point. The advice says hide the hook inside the worm so the bait looks natural. For a base, fine. A bass has crushing jaws that flatten soft plastic and drive a buried point home on the set. A bluegill has none of that. Its jaws are lined with fine, gripping teeth built to hold soft prey, not to crush metal through worm flesh. So when the point is buried, the fish inhales the whole bait, clamps down, and holds, and your hook set pops the worm right back out of its mouth with the point still wrapped in meat. The old saying covers it. Leave the hook a place to go. A buried point has nowhere to go. An exposed point has exactly one job, and does it the instant the mouth closes. Thread in through the thick head end, push the worm up the shank, and bring the tip back out through the side so it rides just proud of the flesh. For the anglers chasing the true giants, there is a more guarded version of this, because the biggest bluegill almost always strike a small, soft plastic from the back. A few veterans rig the hook into the very tail of the bait instead of the head. They call it tail gunning, and it intercepts the exact attack the footage keeps showing. It is a quiet edge for pulling slabs out of pressured water, so now you can hook the fish in front of you. The trouble is, in the heat of summer, the fish in front of you are the small ones. The giants have vanished to a place most anglers never think to look, and the map to them was printed in a magazine 60 years ago, then quietly allowed to go out of print. In July of 1965, Outdoor Life ran a story titled "Living End for Bluegills." The premise was almost heretical then, and it still is now. A strip of plain white pork rind, the cheapest scrap of bait in the store, outfishing everything else for the biggest summer bluegill. Here is the pattern the article laid out, and it holds up because it is built on how the fish actually works. Once spawning ends and the water turns hot, the heavy post-spawn fish leave the shallows and scatter across deep flats, 10 to 25 feet down, grubbing nymphs out of the bottom. They are scattered, picky, and almost nobody fishes for them down there. The rig was a small bell sinker on the bottom and a short dropper above it, carrying a fly-size hook with a slim white pork strip. You drift it slowly across the flat. White holds its visibility in deep, dim water where colors die. The rind flutters like something alive, and unlike a worm that is stripped in one bite, it is nearly indestructible. Why does a white sliver beat a premium lure? Because of how a bluegill sees, and the vision research here is exact. Bluegill carry two color cone systems, one tuned near 540 nanometers and one near 640, green and red. In plain terms, they are wired to pull contrast out of the greenish freshwater light, the exact backdrop those flats sit in, and their sharpness is staggering. In good light, bluegill have been measured detecting prey less than 1% brighter than the background behind it. 1%. They also carry a high-resolution patch in the retina, the area centralis, that fisheries researchers have shown sits along their feeding line of sight, and even shifts as the fish ages and its diet changes. A bright white strip against green water is not subtle to a bluegill. It is a flare, and what about muddy water or low light, where even that eye goes dark? Then the fish switches senses entirely. Down each flank runs the lateral line, a row of tiny motion detectors called neuromasts that read the smallest movements in the water, the way you feel a truck pass before you hear it. It is sensitive enough to track the invisible wake a moving creature leaves behind. In one striking study, catfish followed a wake more than 10 seconds old, across over 50 body lengths, on that sense alone. A bluegill uses the same equipment to find food it cannot see. This is why the old hands quietly swapped soft lead shot for harder, denser tungsten. A tungsten weight ticking on gravel throws a sharper, higher click than dead soft lead, and a curious fish keys on the sound and comes to investigate. It is not magic, it is reading the fish's own hardware against it. Sit with what that adds up to. A page from 1965, costing nothing, beats a shelf of modern lures, which is exactly the kind of knowledge that does not survive in an industry that needs you to keep buying. The fish gave the old anglers the answers, they just listened. Which leaves only the system that ties all of this together. The rod, the line, and the 10-second check that turns every one of these truths into fish on the stringer. None of this works behind a clumsy setup, so build the rig to match the fish. Start with the line. Heavy, stiff line stands out, and it stiffens your bait against that delicate suction, so drop to 2 to 4 pound test. Fluorocarbon is worth it here. It sinks, and underwater it nearly disappears, which matters enormously to an eye that reads 1% contrast. Then rethink the rod, and this is where most anglers undersize. The cheap little push-button combo is fine for a child. A serious panfish hunter reaches for a long ultralight, 8 to 10 feet, and the length does two jobs. It lets you lay a tiny lure far out onto clear, deep water without your shadow ever reaching the fish. And it works as a long shock absorber because a real bull bluegill does not pull in a straight line. It turns that flat, saucer body broadside and wheels in tight, dizzying circles, and that spinning will twist and snap light line in a heartbeat. The long rod soaks up the surges, and a tiny swivel a foot above the hook kills the line twist before it starts. People who have fought a 1-pound gill on light tackle do not laugh at panfish twice. The man who wrote that 1965 article said it best. A big bluegill puts a bass to shame in a stubborn fight, and he was right. Now run the old-timer's precast check, the one that takes 10 seconds and saves an hour. Hold the baited rig up at eye level and look at it from the side. 3 questions. Is the hook gap wider than your thumbnail? If yes, size down. Is the worm trailing more than half an inch below the bend? If yes, pinch it off. Is the point buried in the bait? If yes, push it back through until the tip shows. Point visible. Worm compact. No free tail. That is a rig that converts bites instead of donating bait. And when it is right, the float itself tells you. The maddening little twitches that never developed stop. In their place, you get a single, deliberate dip. The float goes down and stays down, because the fish took the whole bait at once with nothing to nibble first. You do not wait for the third movement anymore. You set on the first clean one, the small hook seats inside the small mouth, and the point catches the instant the jaws close. How big can this go? The all-tackle world record bluegill weighed 4 pounds 12 ounces, caught by T.S. Hudson at Katona Lake, Alabama, back in 1950. A fish 15 inches long with the girth of a dinner plate. Most of us will never touch that. But the giants in your own water are bigger than the ones you have been catching, and they have been feeding on your bait all along, from the wrong end, just out of reach of a hook that was never built to fit them. What felt like a lake full of thieving ghostfish was an engineering problem on the end of your line, decided 13 milliseconds at a time. Fix the mouth-to-metal match, trim the bait, expose the point, and the same dock on the same morning gives up a stringer of slabs. That is the science. That is the wisdom the old bank fishermen carried without a single gadget. Subscribe to Forbidden Lures for more field-tested, evidence-backed angling the tackle industry would rather keep in the dark. Keep your lines tight, and watch the next frame closely.